responsibility. Okay? To stand in the right place, be quiet, and smile. And I accomplished all of that rather well. Although this is the third of my 4 children. She was the third of my 4 children to get married. 2 sons, her, and I have another son. And I will tell you, daughters' weddings are at least 3 times as exhausting, 3 times as emotional, 3 times as crying, 3 times, name anything, 3 times as a son's wedding. Oh yeah, oh yeah. And those were breezes. I just,
Okay.
anyway, she held, the event was at Dover Hall, which I've lived here for 20-something years and didn't know it was there. But if you don't know it, it's quite a phenomenal place. Anyway, enough of that. I want to remind us what we're doing and what we have done because we had a week off. And then you'll notice until next week we're going to talk about the Bible. And so I won't have notes. That's my wheelhouse. But I want to remind you that we were talking about the whole immigration issue. And I said in our first week that I think of this as, from my perspective, as a question of Christian ethics. And in circumstances that deal with very modern issues, and immigration is a very modern issue. The Bible, as an Old Testament professor, I like to just see what the Bible says. But the Bible doesn't say anything about it, and not in the context of the kind of world we live in. And the ancient world, there weren't borders, and there weren't treaties, and there weren't passports, and there weren't any of that stuff. So, to approach a problem like that, and like many issues we deal with in the modern world, if you're going to take a Christian perspective, I think you have to do at least 3 things. I'm reminding you what we're talking about. You have to know, first of all, what it has been the accepted practice in your culture and why. We looked at that last week, week before last. The history of immigration law in America. You have to have an analysis of the current problem from the standpoint of sociology or medicine or whatever the area is. And we're going to do that this week. And then you can, on the basis of that analysis of what has been and what is, you can ask, well, what are the principles of Christian theology and Christian ethics that are applicable in this context? You follow me so far? You can't just map Christianity, the Bible, onto the modern world because, in many cases, because it won't map, right? So today we're looking at, if last week we looked at the history of immigration law and immigration experience, what has happened in this country. Today we're going to look at as many of the current dynamics as we can, because I think that a lot of the stuff I hear, especially on both sides, I hear stuff from my more aggressively Jesus nicks, I don't know what to call them, who don't take the real world into account at all. And then I hear from people on the other extreme who don't, it seems to me, don't seem to know the facts in some cases, but they have their ideologies. And by the way, I would like to say that I think ideology is dangerous, no matter whose ideology it is. It helps to know what's actual before you start making proclamations. That's just me. So here we go, and I've researched this, mostly with the federal government, although sometimes the federal government doesn't have data. These are just a list of things people will say that aren't exactly right. One of the things people are saying nowadays is that we're being invaded. In fact, Pew Research Center study from November of last year indicate that the population of undocumented immigrants in the United States has diminished significantly in recent years, dropping from a peak of 12.2 million in 2007 to only about 10 million, in 2016. So the trend is down, not up. Although, oddly, when we started the separating families and all that kind of stuff, apparently to try to discourage people from coming, it had the opposite effect. So there's been a surge recently. People seem to be thinking, well, we better get in now while we can, kind of thing. The problem, here's number 2, primarily involves Hispanics crossing the U.S. border with Mexico. Contrary to that impression, the top country of origin for new immigrants coming into the U.S. in 2017, we don't have 2018, I couldn't find 2018 data, was, guess where?
China.
Huh? India. Followed by Mexico, and then China, and then Cuba. If you combine India and China, Asia is like 70%, Asians are like 68% of the immigrant population. Except, do you see that? I mean, this is what angers me about 24/7 news. Do you see that on TV? The chief problems that immigrants pose to us, this is argued, are economic. First, it's often simply assumed that they take jobs away from American citizens. You've heard that argument, haven't you? According to a 2016 Pew report reflecting 2014 data, that's the latest I could get. Sorry about that. Census is coming up. We'll have a whole bunch of new federal government data. The federal government data is old. This is the newest I could find. Unauthorized immigrants constituted, this was in 2014, 5% of the civilian workforce. Not surprisingly, they appear in concentration in certain labor-intensive, low pay, and seasonal industries. You can probably guess. They represent 26% of farm workers, 15% of construction workers, mostly drywallers and roofers. You ever hung drywall? You ever roofed in August?
One time.
Yeah. You ever roofed anything in August?
Yes.
Did you like it? Did you want to do it for a job?
They paid me.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. 9% of production workers, mostly food processing, mostly chicken plants, things like that, and some textiles. 9% of service employees, and only 2% of all, of all other fields combined. Now let's think about what that means. Farm workers, drywallers, and roofers, chicken cutter-uppers. What do you call those? Chicken processors. Most Americans are not beating down the doors to get those jobs. Yes.
Well, you say 9% of those people are holding those jobs.
Right.
That means 91% of Americans
That's
are
right.
holding those jobs.
Other jobs, yes.
Working.
Yeah, that's right, that's right. And it's also, employers report, of course, that if it weren't for these immigrants, illegal, undocumented, I don't know what illegal, they wouldn't be able to fill the jobs. And our tomatoes prices would go sky high. When I think about it, do you remember we talked about 2 weeks ago, it's called the Braceros program that we used to have with Mexico. It started right at the end of the Second World War and was concluded in 1964 for reasons I haven't been able to. Do you remember us talking about that? That was a program whereby we had an agreement with the government of Mexico where Mexicans could come in and do these kind of jobs. We knew they were here, they were documented, they were on a program, and it was all worked out for how long they would stay, and then they'd go back home and then come back. The statistics suggest, by the way, that that's what people do. They come here to make money during a season, and then they go back home because they want to be with their families. Many of them do that. So, in effect, the Bracero program, it seems to me, has continued in effect without being a legal, administered, above board kind of program. I know, and I didn't ask, we had our roof done here a couple of years ago, and there was a group of Hispanics came, and we found out they were all related. Uncle so-and-so was the crew chief, and they were all cousins and stuff. And I sat and watched them in amazement. I never saw people work so hard in all my life as they did on our roof in August, and it was hot. The second thing about the job business is that immigration hardliners object to allowing undocumented immigrants access to governmental services in the U.S. on the assumption that these immigrants are freeloaded, that is, utilizing services at the expense of tax-paying citizens. Nothing farther from the truth. Let's see, who did these studies? Federal government, the IRS, estimates that undocumented workers paid $13.6 billion in federal taxes in 2015. The Social Security Administration estimates that they contributed $12 billion in payroll taxes in 2010, never going to get a cent of it back, right? They were effectively underwriting the Social Security program with no hope for ever recouping their investment. On the state and local level, the Institution on Taxation and Economic Policy estimates that unauthorized workers paid $11.7 billion in state and local taxes. They pay that annually. Again, essentially funding programs from which, in many cases, they cannot benefit. Yeah. Hardliners also assume that unauthorized immigrants commit crimes, especially violent and drug-related crimes, at a higher rate than the statistical. The federal government doesn't keep statistics on this, nor do 49 states. The only state that keeps any kind of statistics on who commits crimes in terms of whether they're documented or undocumented is, and this won't surprise you, I don't guess, is the state of Texas. Yeah, exactly. And there, undocumented persons represent 6% of the overall population, and they committed, what would you guess, 5.9% of the crimes, which means exactly proportional to what you expect. Homicides are committed by mostly the 80% of the population who are native born commit 90% of all the homicides. So, but this stands to reason. This is something people don't understand about, also about homeless people. I did some work with homeless people for a little while, a couple of 3 years at one point in my career. I mean, they don't want to have anything to do with law enforcement. Because, you know, if you're undocumented and you get a speeding ticket, now you've come to the attention of the very people who can, you know, deport you and send you back home. So they are terrified about any kind of even minor involvement in with law enforcement. This next one is a personal peeve of mine. As calls for English only, or for establishing English as the official language of the country, or of specific states in the Union suggest, many immigration hardliners harbor suspicions that immigrants, especially Spanish-speaking populations, pose a threat to cultural continuity. A failure to learn English quickly, in this view, demonstrates an unwillingness to assimilate to the dominant culture, and very nearly signifies an animus against that culture. However, according to the Washington Post report in 2018, assimilation today among all the populations, Latin America and Asia, looks a lot like it did a generation ago and 100 years before that, when most immigrants came from Europe. A panel of experts assembled by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine did an extensive research project in 2015, and they noted that across the generations, today's immigrant groups are catching up to and even exceeding the general U.S. population in a host of important social and economic indicators. They're speaking English too, with virtually all the children being fluent by the time they finish middle school. this is something about us as a culture that goes back all the way to at least to Ben Franklin. One of the earliest, if you remember, we talked about this 2 weeks ago, one of the earliest influxes of the one population group into the country was, I'm a double physical degree. That's good. We're Germans, some of my ancestors. This is Ben Franklin writing in a publication of his called Observations Concerning the Increase of Mankind, 1751. He's asked, why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will be so shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our anglifying them? When you think of Pennsylvania, do you think, oh yes, the German state? You do know the Pennsylvania Dutch, as they're called, the Amish, and that they're the descendants of this group of people, and we cherish them, their furniture and their cooking. By the way, that's something as an American who lived abroad. That's something I've come to be very proud of. Ketchup. Do you know who brought us ketchup? What its ethnic origins are? Chinese from San Francisco. It's a variation of a fish sauce that they made. Of course, salsa, right? Spaghetti, pizza. You almost sauerkraut, sauerbraten. And I could go on and on and on and on. Nothing except, I think, scrambled eggs and biscuit. No, biscuits are scones. You see what I'm talking about? We ought to be grateful. This shocked me to learn this. The largest mass lynching in U.S. history occurred in New Orleans, Louisiana in 1891, when 9 Italian immigrants were hung after being found not guilty of murder. Mass arrests of Italians in New Orleans followed, as did a nationwide outbreak of violence against Italians. Teddy Roosevelt, later to become president of the United States, commented publicly that these lynchings were, quote, rather a good thing. Close quote. Ironic, well, Ken Cuccinelli. Now, historically, the U.S. immigration policy has reflected the nation's social and economic concerns, justified or not, in response to specific demographic circumstances. Meanwhile, I am arguing that many of the issues that proponents of increasing restrictions on immigration raise today do not correspond, in fact, to current realities. Furthermore, and here's where we turn to something we really all ought to be thinking about. A set of data regularly overlooked seems to point rather to the need for accepting larger numbers of immigrants into the country than we currently do. First, the intergenerational imbalance between baby boomers and millennials indicates a looming need to supplement the workforce with significant numbers of immigrant workers. At the point of its greatest involvement in the labor force, 1997, boomers numbered 66 million. According to Census Bureau projections, the millennial population will number 75 million at its peak, so that an unrealistic 88% of all millennials will have to be employed in order to replace retiring boomers. Think about that. That's not going to happen. So there could be a huge chunk of folks missing. Second,
not to disagree, but some people would say that the advent of automation.
Yeah, I'm coming to you. Yeah, I'm coming to you. I'm coming to you next. Actually, third. Second, this new ratio between boomers and millennials reflects a broader demographic shift In 2016, those 65 years old or older accounted for 15% of the total population. That was 3 years ago. Projections suggest that by 2060, the 65 plus age bracket will represent 23% of the population, nearly doubling in raw numbers. The 2030s will see a number of demographic turning points. By 2030, all of the boomers will be over 65. By 2035, the elderly will outnumber children for the first time in U.S. history. Yes?
There just was a chart in Wall Street Journal this past week,
Right.
and it said this is the first year that millennials have outnumbered boomers in absolute terms. And the point they were trying to make is, while they don't, this was a voting issue,
Yeah.
whereas while they don't show up in the same percentages as boomers to the polls,
Yeah.
they will be significantly larger portion
Yeah.
by 2024, so.
There are a number of things that are setting up some intergenerational civil war, actually. Because those of us who are 60, I will be in this group of the 65 plus before 2035, by some significant point. And I've had discussions with my children, and you know, they don't think they're ever gonna see Social Security, and they wanna see something done to change it. And I said, don't you even, you know, you keep your grubby little paws, you know. I brought you into this world, I put you all the way through college. You know, I'm making fun of it. That's gonna be, I think, that's a looming issue. It's gonna be quite a source of some contention in our culture. But anyway, that struck me that in the 2035, elderly, 65 and older, will outnumber children for the first time in U.S. history. That's never been before. Sometime in the 2030s, population increased by immigration, even if they remain unchanged, will outpace natural growth. Do you know what I'm saying when I say that? Third, although the problems associated with declining natural population growth and an aging demographic will reach an apex in just over a decade, their effects are already surfacing. According to the data released recently by the U.S. Department of Labor, the web is a good thing, you know. You can go straight to the Department of Labor, you can go straight to these places and find this stuff, instead of running all around all over about 20 libraries. It's great fun. The U.S. economy had 7.6 million unfulfilled jobs, but only 6 million available workers at the end of January 2019. The 11th straight month of such a labor shortage. Not surprisingly, the greater shortages are, what would you guess? What sectors of the economy?
Skilled mechanics.
Manual labor, service jobs such as home health care, and hospitality workers.
The shortages?
The greatest shortages. That's according to the U.S. Department of Labor. I notice in particular that, such as home health care workers category, because of my personal experience with my in-laws. The consequences for the U.S. economy of an aging population combined with labor shortages are, of course, difficult to predict in detail and especially in degree of magnitude. But at least 3 areas seem to me certain to experience the negative effects. 1, since Social Security depends on the younger workforce paying into the system to support the older retirees, shrinkage in the former accompanied by the growth of the latter, fewer young people, more old people, the math there is just not good. Number 2, adjustments in immigration policy that would encourage immigration in numbers sufficient to maintain the age balance of the population seem to me only to be common sense. Furthermore, since statistics suggest that immigrants already fill a large percentage of the economy's labor-intensive, low-skilled jobs, such as farm workers and construction laborers, Any proportional decrease in the immigrant workforce will likely create even greater labor shortages. In turn, these shortages would increase the cost of goods and services like tomatoes and hotel rooms and exert significant inflationary pressures. Finally, however, and this is the one that gets me, the consequence most terrifying to me to contemplate involves the potential harsh impact on elder care. Who will be the caregivers, the CNAs, and the technicians in 2030 when I'm 73? I want them to be there, and I want them to be good. Right? Now, that's my summary of what I could find out from various research sources of the United States government and the state of Texas. Thank it for one little bit of information. Yes?
Do you think that there's a correlation, and you talk about the jobs that aren't being fulfilled,
Right.
but the largest group of folks coming into this, or from India, that they're going into the high-tech jobs?
Actually, the statistics suggest they're not.
Oh, really?
They're opening convenience stores and running hotels. The second generation goes to law school and medical school and engineering school. But the first generation typically comes and goes into entrepreneurial kind of businesses. Yeah. Somebody? Were you suggesting? No. Yeah.
I have a question.
I have an answer. Maybe.
I hope so. I overheard a conversation where a young man was saying that his father was retiring, and I assume that he was an immigrant, and that he had to go back home. The mother and the son were able to stay, but the father had to go back home. Is that common?
I don't know how common that is, but I hear all. The only thing I know about these kinds of things are anecdotal, like you. And most of my anecdotal stuff comes from actually my wife, who is the IB coordinator at Henrico High. And Henrico, in her IB program, she doesn't have a majority population group. There are, she's got Asians and Hispanics and Indians. By Asians, I mean Chinese, and also in pluralities all across.
Well, Shirley, was that because the government said you had to go back, or was that because the family couldn't support the father here?
I couldn't ask questions. I was
Right,
not
well,
in
you
that
just-
situation. I just overheard it, and it has bothered me ever since I overheard it.
Although it does sound
because
like maybe he could retire over there, but couldn't retire here,
He's this person is a hygienist in a dentist office, and his mother, and he said when his father has to go back because he's retired, he wants his mother to come live with him. So that's how the conversation
It
went.
could be
So
work
I don't know.
visas.
So it's
That's
not-
what I was
So
thinking.
many work visas.
Do
Work
what?
visa, maybe?
Work
Yeah, I mean,
visas, he
when
might
you're
lose
retired-
his work visa.
Yeah, when you retire, you can't get a work visa because you're not working, you're retired.
Well, that's what I was
That's not
thinking
fun.
also, yes.
Yeah, and I have another one, an example of firsthand, a woman that we know that's Argentine.
Yeah.
And she had to go back to Argentina to claim her retirement from Argentina.
Right.
Yes.
And
Just like we
then
were
she
back.
came back to America.
Yeah.
But that was to get that money.
She was getting two retirements.
She did not get one from America.
Oh.
She had to go back to Argentina to get that money.
She may have gotten one from her job if she had one in America, but she didn't get Social Security.
She would have had she paid and been
Yeah.
in the system.
She had a
didn't.
401 maybe, or something, but,
She may have avoided those
okay,
things.
to each his own.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Japan is.
Japan, look to Japan.
Yeah.
Look to Japan. Japan is our future. Yeah, yeah. And to an extent, Northern Europe. Germany's beginning to feel some of these problems. Yes.
We have so many more people coming in Japan, though. I mean,
That's it. They don't have any, but they won't.
That's right,
They
so
They
I
won't
can't
let
look to
anybody.
Japan.
Uh,
I think that's an extreme view.
Well, my point is that if we're going to rely on native population growth, replacing ourselves, that's what Japan is trying to rely on,
I don't
and it's
think
not working.
anybody is arguing
Yeah.
that. I think they're
Well-
trying to say we should have legal immigration, and I don't understand why it shouldn't be legal.
Yeah.
But
What will illegal look like is what we're talking about.
yeah, but the Japanese don't want any.
No, they don't want
immigration.
any. I heard them there was on a BBC program where they were talking about that. The Japanese are among the most xenophobic people on the face of the earth. And so they don't really care. There was somebody over here, yes.
Yeah, what I would like you to think about is to expand the sense of against immigration to merge or morph into protection of what we consider to be ours.
Yeah, see, we need to have immigrants here to protect what we consider to be ours. And that's why I'm serious about that, economically and otherwise. And it also, that attitude, I'm not trying to start a fight with you, but for someone with my background, in terms of how my family got here, the whole attitude of protecting what we have, what is ours, from immigrants. If that had been the dominant idea at any point in history prior to 1886, a big part of my family wouldn't be here, right? Because the part of my family that was already here would have decided that the part of my family that had just decided to come needed to be kept out to protect what the part of my family that was already here considered to be ours.
And where I was trying to lead you was the argument against that thought is as much of an ethical issue.
Oh, it is an ethical, yeah, we'll get
than the immigration.
We'll get to that next week, which is when I'm in my wheelhouse. So we're somebody else, yes, please.
So if we don't have wars to resort the table every 30, 50 years, don't have major wars, conflicts where the victims amounts, and we're not the clutching point for nuclear scientists and people to invent the next best things, then how does this trend in the future without war, or without a resorting of the affairs?
That's asking me to be a futurist, but I will tell you what I do think is evident when you look across time and extend, and that is that especially we seem to have an animus against Hispanics. They're the ones you see on TV. It's the southern border, and I'm troubled, among other things, by the fact that a lot of what goes on in South and Central America, a lot of the difficulties down there, the drug wars and all that kind of stuff, are at least an indirect, in most cases, and in some cases direct, reflection of American policy. For example, all of those drug wars they have in Mexico when they're shooting each other up. Can you name a Mexican gun manufacturer? Can't, because there aren't any. You know where those guns come from? Here. Yeah. Guatemala, 1954. Dominican Republic, 1963. Chile, 1972. Honduras, 1979. We go down there. We have had a history of breaking up democratically elected governments because we didn't like the democratically elected government that was elected. I can go on. We've had our finger in Central and South America since the Monroe Doctrine, and we haven't done it particularly well. So there are people down there who are desperate for their lives, and we tell them to line up at the embassy. If they're lined up at the embassy, it just makes them good. That's a good place to get shot. Are you following what I'm saying? We have a certain moral responsibility for the situation we've created over not just this year, not just last year, but over the last century. Yes.
This isn't immigration, but I'm sure everybody saw the news about what was going on in Chile. The rioting.
Yes.
That's all millennials.
Yeah.
And the fare increase for the subway went from about $1 to $1.17, but it is a second increase.
Yeah.
These are all young people who have debt, like our millennials, who are really fighting against the haves, have-not issue. That, I think, is our future.
I think there's
Less so
going
than
to,
the
there's going to be some of that, but all of this is going to mix in together. I think there is going to be generational strife,
Yes.
but that's not the subject I've chosen to talk about here, was immigration. But I see that, in my own family. My kids clearly don't see the world quite the way I do. I mean, and there are times, and if you have kids in their 20s and 30s, There are times we'll be talking and I'm going, did I raise you or how exactly? Did you, and I'm still trying to figure out what makes these guys tick, and they grew up in my household. But,
And as I listen to this, we're focusing on the U.S.
yeah,
And rightly so.
yeah,
But we're not the only ones that are dealing with this.
that's right. That's right. We're not.
In
We're not.
fact, very few countries
Are avoiding it right now.
have the same attitude.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I can't influence, German politics.
No.
So
But I'm just wondering if it's not a condition of man issue as well as a
oh,
local
well,
issue.
well, certainly, there's some of that. People are running away from certain parts of the world because other people are being extremely mean to them, and inhuman. So that if that weren't the case, there'd be a lot less pressure. If there wasn't a war in Syria, if there was, you can go on, but there is. Someone else? Yes, please.
Your immigration numbers, or do the immigration numbers reflect the number of refugees or people running from
Yeah,
it
we're
as
gonna talk
opposed to
about-
running to the
We're gonna talk
US?
about refugees, and let's go ahead and do that now. I thought we'd talk about that a lot next week, but we can talk about it some now. One of the things that really bothers me in the current discussion is I think the absolute need to distinguish between a refugee and an immigrant otherwise.
A voluntary.
Right, right. Because there's a difference between, as I did, deciding to go to Europe to do my graduate degree. That was a decision I made. I didn't have to do that. There was nobody forcing me to that. There were places in America I could have got a graduate degree. I decided I wanted to do that because I wanted to and because the Swiss had let me, right? And they watched me like a hawk, and buddy, the Swiss, you think it's tough. I got my degree February the 19th, and I received a letter about 2 days later that I was to be out of the country by March the 19th. That's how long they gave me. I was. I already planned to be. I knew that letter was coming, but there was no hanging around. That's one thing. It's another thing when ISIS is strafing the city. When the narcotics gang wants your 14-year-old daughter, you'll get motivated. And I tell you, I'll make this confession in front of you, motivated in that way, somebody's law won't mean anything to me. You can talk to me about law all day. Right? I'm going to get my daughter out of there. Right? Yes.
But the news this week demonstrated that a bunch of gunmen with a bunch of cars in Mexico could seize a town of 800,000 people.
Yeah.
And have them turn over
Yeah.
a drug lord.
Yeah.
Because they were all in fear.
Yeah. Yeah.
And because I think the drug guys had captured the families of the police
Yes.
officers.
Yes.
And so there's 800,000 right there
Yes.
that could seek sanctuary.
Yes.
Statistically, this does create a bit of a problem.
Yeah, all right, but see, now we're getting to some where I always think that people should be more careful about the unintended consequences, or sometimes the foreseeable consequences of what you're doing, and stop it, and rather than get 3 years down the line and say, oops, I wish we hadn't gotten here. And you just said, how many men with what?
I don't know how many men.
It was about 50
But they had
Uzis.
automatic, I heard they had a 50 caliber mounted to the back of a truck.
Sure.
Didn't somebody hear that?
Oh, they have no trouble
They
getting
had
that.
tanks. They called them
Yeah,
communes.
yeah. Where did that come from? Where did they get those weapons?
Operation Fast and Furious?
Well, yeah, I doubt that because there weren't that many of them, but Operation Fast and Furious was an effort to trace this kind of thing.
There's still more than half of those guns are still in.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. That's true. How many were there total?
2,000 plus.
Yeah.
Only 700 has been recovered.
Yeah. My point being, those narcotic cartels wouldn't be, where their major source for weapons is, their major source for a market for their goods is, yeah. Please.
Hopefully I won't go to jail for saying this, but.
Well, if you do, I'll go with you.
Yeah, because I understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
A good friend of mine, Curtis Woods, was killed in the early '80s smuggling weapons down in Nicaragua.
Well, doesn't the Soviet Union also provide a fair number of weaponry?
I don't think
I mean,
to
we're
that
not
part of
the
the,
sole
I don't think,
manufacturer
I don't
of
think
weapons.
to our
that
part,
part of the
I don't
world.
think to our hemisphere, they do, in the Mideast, I'll have to check that. I don't have the impression that they do in this hemisphere.
In
Yes.
that part of the world, we were both in the military, and the sheer number of people that I sent, I worked with
Now,
intelligence.
in that part of the world, what part of the world?
Central part of the world, I'm sorry, Central America.
Central America, okay, go.
I was sending linguists there continuously for years on end, because we claimed to be fighting drugs there, so we'd send our soldiers down, and the sheer amounts of ammunition, gun, people that we've sent there, although when we send them there, we tell them that we're not going to recognize that you're part of the United States if you get captured or something happens to you, even though we're gonna pay your salary the whole time, send you down there to do this dirty job because we like to claim we have a war on drugs, even though we won't talk to the suburban folks just like us, where the drugs are being used, because we like to think we don't have a drug problem. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's my point.
That's the summary.
We tend not to look at things in a very global, and I don't mean,
Exactly.
let me use another word, in terms of interconnections,
Yes.
right? And we want to, I mean, I'm sorry, but building a wall is not gonna fix any of this stuff,
Nope.
right? Not gonna fix any of it. And when you approach things with that sort of simplistic, it's a matter of physically keeping somebody out of somewhere. I'm not, doesn't make me have a great deal of optimism about the solution for that. Other questions or comments? This has been a good conversation. And let me say also, I don't pretend to be an expert on this. When the topic came up, I thought, well, I am not an expert on this, but I know how to research. And so I started researching. And just in a couple of weeks, this is the kind of stuff I turned up. Right? Which says to me that what we need, and it's not just to address the immigrant, because I hear there are interconnections here. Right? We've already talked about intergenerational. We've talked about, some cultural and economic needs in another part of the world. We've talked about some moral responsibilities toward refugees, What's needed is something more than bumper sticker slogans. Got to be some hard thought, some deep thought, and some broad thinking in order to address these kinds of problems. Yes.
Do you think your attitude toward this, and I'm not, any of us, attitude toward this would be different if you were a rancher in Texas and you owned 5,000 acres of cattle?
Yeah, I do think it would be. I think I'd probably be more adamantly the way I am.
I think their problem, we Easterners and city people analyze what their problem is, and we talk about the solution, and it's two totally different things depending on where you're located.
Yeah, most of them though don't want to, they for heaven's sakes don't want a wall that splits their cattle off from the water. I mean, I've heard a lot of negative reactions from people out in that part of the country over property rights. Yes.
Grow up in El Paso, Texas
Yeah.
during the 50s.
Yeah, you did?
Yes.
Okay.
You were very used to the thousands of people coming in from Mexico every day.
And then going back home.
And then they would go back home.
Yeah.
That was the economy there. That's the way we worked.
One of the things, I read something some years ago that pointed out that if you look at where undocumented from South and Central America, which means mostly Mexico, or it used to, now it's Guatemala and Nicaragua, but it used to mean mostly Mexico, where they come to in the United States is what was Mexico, where a lot of them have family who happen to be American citizens. And we don't recognize that the redrawing of the border didn't reshape a culture. You follow what I'm saying, or its heritage. So, go ahead.
I don't know that I would agree with your point that it's the Easterners. We have a farm in my family, and my grandfather was faced with exactly what you're discussing 50 years ago. Do you want to go with migrant laborers who you don't want to provide adequate housing, adequate salary, and adequate, basically, you have
Civil
to do
protection.
everything for them.
Yeah.
And some of the neighboring farms indeed chose to go that way. And it's not new problems at all.
I mean, we didn't talk about that, although it does seem to be, to me, it seems to be a matter of equity, or inequity. We heard about, a few months ago, about the processing plants in Mississippi where they rounded everybody up. Did we hear anything about the employers being charged with employing illegal and undocumented? And we're not going to either, until something changes, because there's a lot of wink, wink, nod, nod that goes over these issues.
And not just corporate wink, wink, nod, nod. The Eastern families that hire the immigrant maid or the gardener, that they just don't check.
Yeah, don't tell me, I don't want to know.
That happens.
Oh, yeah, happens a lot. Yes.
Well, and going back to her point, I mean, I can remember growing up in a farming community, knowing that you go to the Northern Neck and these metal sheds where people are living are housing folks who are out there getting the cantaloupes.
Right.
Or you go to the Eastern Shore and the folks picking the tomatoes or the whatever are living in metal sheds that we wouldn't want to live in.
Yeah. I mean, that's something we haven't talked about.
That's been going on for years.
Yeah, that's something we haven't talked about, and I'll come to you soon. But as I understand that Braceros program I talked to you about earlier, you couldn't do that kind of thing because it was governmentally, I mean, it was above board, the government knew about it, it was governmentally regulated, and there were it bothers me that part of the thing that goes on with the undocumented and our wink, wink, nod, nod is those people don't want to get sent back home. They're making pretty good money, but they're really vulnerable to all sorts of mistreatment. Yes.
I reread books because my memory seems to survive on me so far. And Will and Ariel Durant started in 1935 writing their story of civilization.
Right.
And they spent 32 years, I think, putting that together. At the end of it, they wrote a little short 100-page book called The Lessons of History by Will and Ariel Durant. One of their, they look at biology and competitions, biological in the world, and they look at economies, they look at race, they look at a lot of fundamental concepts, and it's an interesting read, written in '68, slightly dated, but perennial problems. When they talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, it really hurts. It really hurts reading their assessment of that. One of the perennial things they mention is that the growth of the ignorant and the power that they seek is constantly opposed to the numbers of people who are well educated and have wealth. And he looks at this disparity in wealth and how it causes tension over the centuries and back in Roman times, and how it collapsed some of the Roman leaders. And it's exciting read, interesting, but I just look at, if we could narrow it down to something I understand better, is how many Presbyterians are having more than 2 children? That's something we could talk about. Why aren't we having 5 children? And how is it this Nicaraguan gal?
You first.
Well, I was afraid to do it. You first. I was afraid to do it, and I'm wondering.
Actually, there are studies that I can answer this. I mean, the question, the why question, you know.
Why are we afraid to have children?
Yeah, the why question can be understood in 2 ways: mechanism and purpose. Why does the rainbow look the way it does? Because of the spectrum. Why do I cry at my daughter's wedding? That has to do with authorship and purpose. So why is a dual thing. I can answer the why in sort of a mechanistic economics way, because there are studies, this is known, there's studies done across the world. The more affluent you become, the fewer children you have. And that is linked, especially, to the more affluent women become, the fewer children you have. And if you don't understand how that works, she'll explain to you. You'll understand it real well by the time you get home.
But I had a brief experience working in a business up in Maryland where an accounting clerk who was of modest capabilities, hardworking, endeavored to do a good job, but modest in her skill sets, bragged to me, she was first generation immigrant.
From?
I think Nicaragua. And she bragged to me that she had 5 nieces and nephews who were doing well in college. And I said, that's wonderful news. And she bragged also that not a single one of them had to pay for their college education. Happened to sting me a little bit at that time.
Why?
Because my 2 were both in college.
And you were paying.
Well, I was.
And they were
Theirs
smarter
may have
than.
been incredibly talented and
Yeah, did she say
recruited
how they were?
highly for their skills and what they added to that college fabric.
Was it merit scholarship or what? Yeah.
It just, it hurt me. I'm sorry.
Don't put your kitchen time machine and make them study harder in high school.
It was statistically improbable.
Actually, that's the thing you don't understand. When the statistics suggest the other thing. If parents come here and bring children and they say, I'm gonna work 2 jobs, right? And you're gonna go to school and you're gonna do well. That's what you're doing for this family. Vietnamese, Honduran, Chinese, Indian, I don't care. That generation typically excels because they are brought up with the value. Mom and dad are busting their horns. What you're doing for this family is getting good grades in school and getting a good education. And they do. They take it very seriously. Yes, please.
We have a fellow working in our company, he's been there about a year, he's from Cabo. He
Yeah.
worked for the State Department for 11 years. They brought him and his family back.
So that they wouldn't get killed.
Right,
But,
he has 9 children.
yeah.
He said in their culture, if you didn't have more than 5 children, you're expected to get a second wife.
Thank you, Lord Jesus, that I was born when and where I was. That second wife stuff, I don't know if you, anyhow.
Natural welfare, yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted
Yeah, I thank you for this discussion because I want us, if anything frustrates me, it's simplistic argumentation. And I hear it everywhere I turn, and these are deep human problems. And if you think they're not going to affect you, think again. Maybe not as directly as somebody who has a ranch on the border, but they're going to affect you. They are affecting you now. We've begun to get an idea about how complicated the situation is. Now we're ready to think about what are the Christian values that ought to guide our approach to these complicated issues. I reject the notion that there is a Christian answer to this. I reject that notion. I do think there are impetuses and impulses from our Christian faith that can help us think through what we would like to see happen. Do you follow what I'm saying? Now, we've already made one of those important distinctions, the distinction between a refugee and an immigrant, and I think that's very important to keep in mind. I thank you for the opportunity to be with you. I'm looking forward to next week because I'm back to the Bible. And I don't have to read off notes. And I'm looking forward to it. Y'all have a good week.